1872, Marseille. The streets buzzed with anticipation as the town prepared for a wedding meant to unite two prominent families. At the center of this celebration stood a gown of exquisite ivory lace, shimmering under the sunlight like spun moonlight. To the eyes of the crowd, it was the very image of purity and joy, a masterpiece of craft and devotion. But behind its delicate folds lay a story woven with grief, secrecy, and perhaps a darkness no one could anticipate. The seamstress who had stitched the gown, Elise Moreau, was a woman both admired and whispered about. She had endured losses no child should face an absent father, a mother who vanished to the countryside, and a fiancé claimed by illness long before the bells rang. Some say she stitched late into the night, tears mingling with the threads, her sorrow embedding itself in the fabric. Was this mourning harmless artistry, or had it transformed into something far more sinister? Guests at the wedding remembered the bride's radiance, the laughter that echoed through the chapel, the delicate aroma of fresh flowers, and the gleam of polished silverware. Yet within hours, the celebration's brightness dimmed. Whispers began, carried by servants and neighbors alike, that the gown itself carried misfortune. The bride's cheeks flushed not with excitement, but with sudden heat. A faint trembling coursed through her limbs. Shadows seemed to linger longer near the hem of the dress, and some swore they heard a faint, rhythmic whisper, almost like the tapping of a needle stitching vengeance into silk. Panic rippled through the crowd. Guests felt dizzy, some clutched at their chests, others stumbled as though the very air had thickened. The laughter and music of an hour before were replaced by murmurs of fear. Blood, perhaps faint and unnoticed at first, marred the gown's pristine whiteness. What had begun as joy had twisted into tragedy? Was this the handiwork of Elise, the grieving seamstress, seeking revenge for losses only she could comprehend? Or had the dress itself become a vessel for forces beyond human understanding, stitched with intent, or with a curse that no hand could fully control? Even the walls of the chapel seemed to bear witness to the horror. Candles flickered without wind, shadows danced in corners where none should exist, and the murmur of the guests became a chorus of terror. In this moment, every stitch, every fold of silk seemed alive with ambiguity. The line between grief and malice, between artistry and vengeance, blurred. Every eye traced the threads. Every mind asked the same question. Had the seamstress woven her sorrow, or had she stitched doom itself into the wedding dress? Tonight, we delve into a story that blends history, horror, and the human psyche. A tale where every stitch may conceal a secret, every hem may whisper a warning, and one gown became a legend that Marseille and perhaps all of France could never bury. Prepare to enter a world where beauty masks horror, innocence masks intention, and the threads of grief may yet unravel into something far darker than anyone dared imagine. Marseille, 1840s. In the narrow, winding alleys of the old town, life moved at a rhythm dictated by the sun and the tolling of church bells. Among these cobblestone streets, a young girl named Elise Moreau carried herself with a quiet diligence that went unnoticed by most, yet drew the wary eyes of those who lingered too long. Orphaned in her early childhood, she was taken in by distant relatives who treated her more as a chore than as family. Parish records note her attendance at services, her punctuality in charity work, and her aptitude for sewing, which soon became her refuge. But refuge does not equate to comfort. While others played in sunlight, Elise sat by candlelight, stitching patterns into fabric as if embedding her silent despair into each thread. Her early life was punctuated by loss. A fiancé, a young man named Henry, fell victim to a sudden fever that swept through the city, one of the many outbreaks that plagued Marseille in those decades. Letters he had sent were kept secret by his family, and rumors suggested the illness had come too swiftly for any effective remedy. Elise was devastated, yet she bore her grief silently, never speaking of the nights spent staring at empty streets, waiting for a figure that would never return. Neighbors would later recall seeing her wandering at dusk, hands stained with ink or thread, whispering under her breath in ways that unsettled the neighborhood. Some claimed she hummed hymns backwards, a practice considered sacrilegious and unsettling, yet perhaps a desperate attempt to make sense of her sorrow. Sorrow alone, however, does not define darkness. As she grew, Elisa's skill with fabric became exceptional, yet a shadow seemed to cling to her wherever she went. Villagers remarked on the eerie precision of her stitching, the way threads met perfectly, the way patterns seemed almost alive, undulating slightly under the lamplight. Church sermons described her as aloof, strange, unsettling, warning parishioners to avoid prolonged contact with her work. At the same time, some pitied her. A widowed neighbor once provided extra flour and sugar to her small household, remarking in her journal that the girl carries the weight of too many sorrows for one soul. This duality, fear and pity, followed her like a specter, shaping both perception and expectation. Elisa's adolescence was spent largely in isolation, punctuated by brief interactions that left impressions of both brilliance and unease. Apprenticeships at local tailoring shops brought her into contact with women who taught her craft. Yet each day of instruction was framed by whispers, her eyes too penetrating, her hands too steady, her silence too loud. Merchants occasionally swindled her, taking payment for threads or fabrics she could ill afford, leaving her with debts she quietly paid from meager earnings. By the time she reached her late teens, she had developed a reputation for being capable, precise, and unusually intense. Letters preserved from this period reveal a girl whose thoughts oscillated between devotion to her craft and quiet ruminations on the injustices she had endured. The parish archives, combined with testimonies from elderly neighbors recorded decades later, paint a picture of Lisa as a woman walking a line between innocence and suspicion. Friends recall moments of genuine kindness, a rescued kitten, a small loaf of bread given to a beggar, but almost immediately, these moments are juxtaposed against her private rituals. She would sew late into the night, muttering to herself, or tracing patterns that others claimed resembled occult symbols. While historians today debate the veracity of these claims, the fear and fascination they inspired in her contemporaries were real. Her grief, it seems, fermented into a subtle bitterness that infused everything she touched. Psychological analysis might suggest that years of loss, social isolation, and repeated minor injustices cultivated a mindset wherein control and perfection became paramount. Every stitch, every seam, may have been an act of mastery over a life largely dictated by forces beyond her control. Yet for others observing her, the same behaviors appeared uncanny, unnatural, and perhaps even malevolent. Religious influence also left its mark. Marseille in the mid-19th century was a city steeped in Catholicism, with clergy often wielding moral judgment as power. Sermons criticized her aloofness, her silence, and the strange focus with which she approached sewing. Priests warned parishioners against being entangled by the hands of one whose sorrow might darken the soul, and some families refused her services for fear that proximity to her work could bring misfortune. In contrast, those who supported her quietly noted her resilience and dedication, framing her not as a harbinger of evil, but as a young woman navigating a world of grief, poverty, and isolation. Letters exchanged with her distant relatives reveal additional tension. They admired her skill but feared her growing obsession with perfection. One note, preserved in an archival collection, reads, "Your needle travels too far into the darkness of your mind. Beware that what you sew for others does not unravel within yourself." Such admonitions, intended as guidance, may have only deepened her retreat into silence, reinforcing her tendency to bury emotion and thought within her craft. Even her social interactions carried a duality. At markets or community gatherings, she engaged politely, never overtly confrontational, yet always observing. Her eyes, remarkably expressive, were said to hold a quiet intensity that left interlocutors unnerved. Some would describe it as seeing too much, others as holding secrets meant for no one else. This contrast between outward civility and inward intensity created a persona both admirable and intimidating, blending the familiar with the uncanny. By the time she reached adulthood, Elise had become a figure both celebrated and feared. Her mastery of fabric, combined with the enigmatic aura surrounding her life, made her indispensable in local society while simultaneously isolating her. The stage was set for the tragedy that would later unfold, a life stitched together by grief and sharpened by isolation, where every thread bore the weight of unspoken sorrow, and where observers could not tell whether they were witnessing skill, obsession, or something darker entirely. And so, as we trace Elise's early years, the central question emerges with growing intensity. When suffering festers too long, does it transform into something malignant? When grief is stitched into the very fabric of one's existence, can innocence survive untouched, or does it inevitably twist into obsession, suspicion, or darker impulses? In the quiet candlelit rooms of Marseille, surrounded by shadows and whispers, Elise Moreau's hands moved with purpose, and with every movement, the line between grief and darkness, between human and legend, grew ever thinner. Marseille, 1872. The city awoke that morning with an air of anticipation that seemed almost tangible. Flags fluttered in narrow streets, bakery windows overflowed with freshly baked bread, and church bells rang in delicate, melodic patterns that echoed across cobblestone alleys. Today was the day of the wedding, an event meant to unite two of Marseille's wealthiest families, a union steeped in social prestige and bound by generations of expectation. Crowds gathered along the streets to glimpse the bridal procession, marveling at carriages painted in gold and cream, horses adorned with ribbons, and flower girls scattering petals as the couple passed. Yet even amidst the splendor, a subtle tension lingered, one that only the keenest eyes might notice, a slight hesitance in the bride's step, a faint tremor in the seamstress's hands, a shadow cast that seemed darker than the morning sun. Elise Moreau, the seamstress behind the infamous gown, moved with measured calm. Her reputation for precision and subtle artistry had already preceded her, but few could have guessed the intensity of the emotions that drove her work that day. Witnesses later described her as composed, almost serene, yet her eyes carried a depth that hinted at decades of grief, loss, and perhaps a restrained anger that had found a channel in thread and needle. The gown itself was a masterpiece, ivory silk interwoven with delicate lace, tiny pearls that caught the sunlight, and embroidery so meticulous that it seemed almost alive. Each stitch, observers would later recall, was imbued with a perfection that no ordinary seamstress could achieve. But perfection, as the day would reveal, can harbor shadows. The ceremony began under the high arches of St. Laurent Cathedral. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the marble floor. The bride entered, radiant and poised, her gown flowing like liquid moonlight. Guests whispered admiration, some noting the faint scent of jasmine that seemed to cling to the fabric, mingling with the perfume of roses. The air was thick with anticipation, laughter, and the subtle rustle of silk. Yet for those who knew to look, unease had already begun to ripple beneath the surface. The groom's smile faltered briefly, the best man's hand twitched nervously, and the officiant's voice seemed to echo oddly, as if carrying a strange resonance that unsettled the pews. As vows were exchanged, a subtle shift occurred. Witnesses later recorded that a chill swept through the cathedral, sudden and inexplicable. Candles flickered despite the absence of draught, and shadows appeared to move independently along the walls. Some guests reported hearing soft whispers, almost imperceptible, as if the very fabric of the room carried murmurs meant for no one in particular. Others claimed to see the gown shimmer unnaturally, the lace twisting in ways that defied ordinary observation. Whether these occurrences were products of fear, heightened anticipation, or something more sinister, they were noticed by enough people to create a persistent sense of disquiet. The procession to the reception hall followed a similar pattern. Carriages rattled along cobblestones, and onlookers waved, yet a subtle unease lingered. Inside the hall, tables groaned under the weight of silver platters and crystal glasses. Food and wine were prepared with care, yet something in the air seemed to alter perception. Conversations began normally, but laughter soon took on a hollow quality, punctuated by uneasy glances and whispered warnings. Guests began to feel faint. Some clutched their stomachs, others stumbled in confusion. The cause was debated immediately. Physicians attending the wedding suggested spoiled wine, improperly stored meat, or a simple outbreak of foodborne illness. But testimonies from servants painted a different picture. The gown itself, they insisted, carried an aura that had infected the air around the bride, influencing those who drew near. It was at the height of the feast that horror struck most visibly. The bride herself collapsed, crimson blotches appearing across the once pristine silk of her gown. Panic erupted. Guests screamed, scattering from tables as confusion rippled like wildfire. Some fainted outright. Others vomited uncontrollably. Servants rushed to assist, yet even their touch seemed to trigger a further sense of dread among those nearby. Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally in corners, and a subtle, almost imperceptible hum could be heard. Some swore it was the seamstress herself. Others argued it came from the fabric. Each report added layers to a narrative that would later confound historians, psychologists, and folklorists alike. Eyewitness accounts diverged sharply. Some claimed to see Lisa standing by the head table, a faint, knowing smile on her lips, observing the chaos with a calm that bordered on eerie. Others described her as frantic, moving swiftly to assist the bride, yet always maintaining a distance, her fingers twitching as if recalling each stitch she had made, each pattern she had imbued with unseen intent. The contrast between her demeanor and the unfolding disaster deepened the mystery. Was she a grieving artisan witnessing the failure of her creation, or a subtle orchestrator of calamity, each thread a channel for revenge? Medical reports from the day remained fragmentary and contradictory. Physicians noted elevated heart rates, pallor, and vomiting among the guests, yet could not identify a definitive source. Some suggested spoiled wine. Others hypothesized a reaction to pollen from floral arrangements. Modern analysis hints at foodborne pathogens, yet the distribution and timing of the symptoms defy straightforward explanation. In juxtaposition, folkloric accounts and later memoirs of guests attribute the effects to a curse woven into the fabric, a malevolent intent that transcended physical cause. Every element of the day carried dual interpretations. The gown, the seamstress, the guests, even the air itself seemed capable of both benign and malignant influence. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the reception hall, whispers continued of silk that carried the weight of grief, threads that trembled with hidden sorrow, and a young woman whose life of loss may have spilled into the very fabric she had created. The juxtaposition of joy and dread, celebration and calamity, reality and superstition, created a tableau that would haunt Marseille for decades. By the evening, the aftermath was complete. Families mourned, guests speculated, and Elise Moreau vanished into the quiet corners of history, leaving behind a dress whose story would be told and retold, each account slightly altered, each retelling adding another layer of fear, fascination, or moral questioning. This wedding, meant to unite, had instead sown uncertainty, horror, and questions that would never fully be answered. Was it the seamstress, the gown, or some unknowable convergence of grief and fate? In examining the events of this day, the story unfolds like the folds of the gown itself, each layer revealing more complexity, more ambiguity, and more darkness than the last. The wedding that should have been a celebration of union became instead a study in terror, perception, and human fragility, setting the stage for myths that would endure long after Marseille had forgotten the names of most attendees. but never the legend of the dress. Marseille, 1872. After the chaos of the wedding feast, the city was abuzz not with celebration, but with whispers of dread. News of the bride collapsing in her ivory gown, guests writhing in mysterious sickness, and servants' claims of unnatural shadows spread rapidly, carried by market gossip, letters, and fearful murmurs. Within days, physicians and clergy alike had arrived at a troubling impasse. No definitive cause for the calamity could be identified. Some argued scientific explanations, tainted wine, contaminated meat, foodborne pathogens, but others claimed to sense something far darker, a spiritual malaise embedded in the very fabric of the dress. It was in this intersection of rationality and superstition that the tale of the seamstress's masterpiece began to crystallize into legend. The physicians of Marseille, bound by the practices of mid-19th century medicine, approached the case with a clinical eye. Autopsies of the most severely affected guests revealed signs of gastrointestinal distress, inflammation, pallor, and traces of plant toxins that might have originated from herbs used in the wedding feast. Yet the variability of symptoms puzzled even the most seasoned doctors. Some guests recovered quickly. Others lingered in weakness for weeks. Scientific consensus faltered, and in its absence, doubt and speculation flourished. Reports were contradictory, incomplete, and often tainted by the biases of those recording them. Physicians blamed fermentation, improper food storage, or common illnesses, yet no hypothesis could fully account for the precise timing, the selective severity, or the uncanny synchrony of the afflictions. Into this vacuum stepped the clergy. Priests of Marseille were quick to interpret the events as a moral and spiritual crisis. They cited scripture, the tainted bread, the poisoned cup, and the biblical warnings against innocence corrupted by malice. Sermons delivered in the weeks following the wedding portrayed Elise Moreau not merely as a grieving seamstress, but as a potential vessel of divine wrath, or worse, a servant of infernal forces. Parishioners were warned to remain vigilant. A seemingly innocent hand could, through intent or curse, wield power capable of altering life and death. These warnings were amplified by vivid imagery, whispered tales of the dress shimmering unnaturally, of shadows that bent toward the bride and followed guests like silent predators, and of a faint, almost imperceptible hum that accompanied the unfolding chaos. The seamstress herself remained an enigma. Interviews and memoirs recorded decades later describe her as composed, even radiant, despite the calamity that surrounded her creation. Some witnesses claimed she smiled faintly, as if anticipating the unfolding events. Others insisted she moved through the hall with quiet urgency, assisting the stricken while keeping her distance. Was she an orchestrator, a passive observer, or merely a woman witnessing the collapse of her craft into chaos? The ambiguity fueled narratives on both sides, science versus superstition, rationality versus belief, innocence versus malevolence. Psychological analysis provides another lens through which to examine the events. Trauma, grief, and social isolation are known to affect human perception, cognition, and behavior in profound ways. Elise's life prior to the wedding marked by loss of a fiancé, family hardships, and societal marginalization may have shaped not only her behavior, but also the perceptions of those around her. Survivors and witnesses, already primed to fear and suspect the unknown, could have experienced heightened suggestibility, collective anxiety, or even mass psychosomatic responses. Shadows in corners, strange movements in the lace, or whispers carried on the wind may have been amplified by stress, expectation, and cultural predispositions toward interpreting unexplained events as supernatural. Yet the persistence of physical evidence complicates the purely psychological interpretation. Stains appeared on the ivory silk, the precise source of which remains contested. Some argued chemical contamination. Others posited the dress itself carried a residue of malicious intent, a cursed thread woven through grief and obsession. Witness statements described the fabric shimmering under lamplight in ways that seemed unnatural, curling slightly as if breathing. Even skeptics concede the description, though likely influenced by fear, cannot be fully dismissed. Whether the phenomenon was optical illusion, psychological projection, or some combination of both, it left an indelible mark on all who observed it. The duality of the explanations, scientific and supernatural, reflects broader societal tensions in 19th century Marseille. The city, a hub of commerce, intellect, and religion, was simultaneously steeped in rational inquiry and tradition-bound superstition. Physicians applied chemical analysis and dissection. Priests invoked scripture and divine judgment. Folklorists recorded oral tales that blended reality and imagination. Each group sought to impose order on chaos, yet each encountered the limits of their understanding. Science could not confirm intent, and faith could not explain observable symptoms. The result was a liminal space where interpretation became as important as fact. Survivor accounts further deepened the ambiguity. Guests recalled sensations of cold, shadows stretching unnaturally, and whispers that seemed to come from no discernible source. Some described fleeting images of shapes within the lace, patterns that twisted unnaturally as if animated. Others argued these were hallucinations induced by illness, fear, or a combination of both. Contradictions abound, where some recalled panic, others recalled quiet dread. Where some swore of the dress's malevolent shimmer, others claimed it seemed inert, merely beautiful. These variations underscore the complexity of the event, highlighting how perception, expectation, and environmental factors interact to produce experiences that straddle reality and imagination. The seamstress's prior history of grief and isolation becomes relevant here. Years of solitude, compounded by past tragedies, may have honed her attention to detail and heightened her sensitivity to nuance. In some accounts, her presence in the room seemed to influence events. A glance, a gesture, or the simple act of holding the dress could coincide with inexplicable phenomena. Was this influence real, or merely a projection of the observer's fears? Psychological frameworks such as priming, suggestion, and social contagion provide plausible explanations, yet they cannot entirely account for the lasting impressions described in archival testimonies. Legends quickly formed around the dress and the seamstress. Tales circulated of shadows moving independently, of fabrics that remembered suffering, and of a bride whose beauty became a vessel of horror. Writers, chroniclers, and folklorists would later elaborate these accounts into cautionary narratives, emphasizing the dangers of grief left unchecked, of skill coupled with isolation, and of seemingly ordinary individuals capable of extraordinary effects when shaped by loss. These legends intertwined with the facts, creating a narrative that resists linear explanation. Even today, historians debate, did Elise Moreau inadvertently catalyze a psychogenic outbreak among guests? Or was there intentional malice hidden in the fabric of her creation? Chemical analyses are impossible to perform on a gown long destroyed. Eyewitness testimonies remain inconsistent. In this ambiguity lies the power of the story. Science and superstition collide, leaving only the haunting image of ivory silk, shadows that seemed alive, and a wedding day transformed into legend. The events of that day illustrate a central tension: the human desire for explanation versus the limits of perception and understanding. Where rationality falters, superstition fills the void. Where belief struggles, psychological complexity thrives. Shadows in silk, whether real or imagined, serve as a metaphor for the intersection of grief, skill, and human fascination with the unknown. Each layer of the narrative, medical, spiritual, psychological, adds depth to the story, yet none fully resolves the mystery. As the guests fled the hall, some physically ill, others emotionally shaken, one fact remained: the wedding that was meant to unite families in joy had instead exposed the fragility of human perception, the potency of grief, and the ease with which ordinary objects could become vessels of terror. The seamstress, her hands trembling or poised with quiet intention, had unwittingly or perhaps deliberately placed all observers in a liminal space between reality and nightmare, a space where shadows lingered longer than they should, and silk seemed to whisper secrets meant for no human ear. Marseille, 1872 to 1885. While one wedding became infamous for tragedy, other brides who donned gowns stitched by Elise Moreau lived to tell stories that were almost as chilling. Their survival, however, did not equate to safety. Memories of pain, disorientation, and inexplicable phenomena haunted them for years. Local archives preserve letters, diaries, and testimonies that paint a picture both intimate and unsettling. Garments that seemed alive, shadows that lingered too long, whispers that emerged from the folds of silk. These women became witnesses to a narrative that blurred the line between reality and imagination, life and legend. Marie-Louise Dufresne, married in 1875, wrote of rashes erupting across her arms and neck, burning as though the silk itself carried a malicious heat. She described the sensation as uneven, almost selective, spreading across the areas that had contact with intricate lace patterns. Physicians of the time inspected her body, yet found no chemical explanation. "It was not poison," she recorded in her diary, "for my blood felt normal, my pulse steady, but the fabric spoke to me, hummed like a faint voice only I could hear." Her account introduces a pattern echoed by others: the interplay between physical discomfort and perceived communication from the gown itself. Another bride, Henriette Beaulieu, reported whispers in the quiet moments before her wedding. "I heard her," Henriette wrote decades later, "the seamstress or the dress, I cannot tell which. It told me to run, to avoid the day that had been spun for disaster." She recalled looking down at her hands, finding them trembling, and glimpsing movement along the hem that was not caused by wind or touch. Shadows seemed to follow her, stretching across the room with an unnatural elasticity. Guests noticed nothing. Servants reported ordinary behavior. The dissonance between perception and observation magnifies the chilling ambiguity. Were these hallucinations the product of pre-wedding anxiety and social pressure, or evidence of something unearthly embedded in the silk? Survivor accounts were rarely consistent. Some dismissed the seamstress as a calculating manipulator, intentionally embedding harm in her work. Others viewed her as a woman tormented by grief and latent misfortune, a conduit for forces beyond her understanding. The discrepancies themselves tell a story about perception, how trauma fractures memory, how fear reshapes observation, and how ordinary objects, here, wedding gowns, become carriers of psychological projection. Interviews decades later reveal both extremes: condemnation and pity, suspicion and reverence. Local folklore intertwined with these personal narratives, amplifying their unsettling effect. Villagers recounted visions of brides in ivory gowns, moving through halls with a grace that belied unseen threats. Some claimed the silk shimmered in lamplight, twisting into shapes that resembled faces or hands reaching outward. Faint laughter was reported in mirrors, audible only when rooms were empty. The resonance of these stories served a dual purpose: preserving collective memory of potential danger, and transforming lived experience into legend. Researchers studying oral history later suggested that memory, expectation, and cultural storytelling could combine to produce events that felt tangible, even if lacking objective evidence. From a psychological perspective, the survivors' accounts highlight the complex interaction between grief, anxiety, and cultural context. Brides of the era were often subjected to immense social pressure, expectations of perfection, and symbolic significance in matrimonial rituals. Any deviation or unforeseen incident could exacerbate stress, heightening sensory sensitivity and imaginative interpretation. The seamstress herself, known for her history of personal loss and isolation, may have unwittingly intensified this effect by projecting subtle cues through meticulous detailing in the gown. Hints of malaise, intentional or not, may have been magnified by fear, creating experiences that felt real and threatening. Physical phenomena, too, were reported. Some brides experienced burns, rashes, or irritation that defied immediate explanation. Others described the texture of the silk changing under touch, stiffening, or loosening without apparent cause. Scholars of textile history note that certain dyes, lacquers, or chemical treatments in 19th century fabrics could cause irritation, but survivors insisted that the effects were localized, precise, and seemingly responsive to their awareness. The possibility of chemical causation coexisted uneasily with accounts of movement, sound, and shadows, creating a liminal space in which science and superstition overlapped. The seamstress's own intentions remain obscured. Letters discovered decades later suggest she harbored complex emotions toward her clients: grief for lost love, bitterness at perceived societal injustice, and meticulous attention to craft. Yet nothing conclusively links her actions to deliberate harm. This ambiguity is central to the narrative, whether her gowns were vectors of supernatural vengeance, instruments of subtle psychological manipulation, or simply unfortunate coincidences filtered through perception. The result is consistent. The survivors carried trauma and stories that no one could easily rationalize. Patterns emerge across accounts. Survivors describe shadows curling unnaturally, whispers originating from folds in the lace, and sensations of touch when none should exist. Yet these patterns are not uniform. Some brides felt no ill effect, while others reported phenomena that lingered for years. Contradiction becomes a narrative tool, highlighting the challenge of separating fact from experience. Each account reinforces the core tension. Human perception is fallible, yet collective memory preserves the terror, giving the ordinary garment a mythic resonance. Cultural context further complicates interpretation. In 19th century France, superstition coexisted with emerging scientific rationalism. Clergy invoked moral lessons, physicians applied empirical observation, and folklorists documented stories blending warning and entertainment. Survivors' experiences were filtered through this milieu, often amplified by expectation. A bride aware of prior tragedies may have been more sensitive to stimuli sounds, movements, textures, interpreting them within a framework of danger and malevolence. Simultaneously, ordinary guests may have failed to perceive subtle cues, reinforcing the divide between those touched by the gown and those seemingly untouched. Some survivors explicitly questioned whether the seamstress herself was cursed. Letters, diaries, and later interviews hint that she may have carried grief and anger so intensely that it embedded itself into her craft. Could intent be transferred into objects? Could concentrated emotion manifest as psychological or even physical influence over others? These questions remain unresolved, but they illustrate why the story persists. The seamstress, her gowns, and the bride's experiences form a nexus of fear, fascination, and ambiguity. Over time, these narratives became cautionary tales. Local communities warned young women against excessive attention to ornamental detail or overly meticulous seamstresses. The gowns were said to remember grief, carrying echoes of pain into new households. Children were told not to touch lace from unknown hands. Brides were urged to remain vigilant in the quiet moments before ceremonies. Oral traditions merged with archival records, producing a tapestry of fear and fascination that extended decades beyond any single wedding. The psychological weight of these experiences was profound. Survivors reported nightmares, heightened sensitivity, and persistent anxiety, often attributing ongoing malaise to the dress. Medical practitioners and clergy offered explanations ranging from chemical irritation to divine punishment. None could reconcile the totality of the phenomena, leaving survivors and later historians confronted with a profound ambiguity. Was the danger external, embedded in silk and stitch, or internal, arising from perception, fear, and expectation. Ultimately, these accounts blur the line between victim and perpetrator, between supernatural agency and psychological projection. Brides lived, yet their lives were marked by trauma. Witnesses' stories vary, but each reinforces the haunting suggestion that the seamstress's creations were more than clothing. They were conduits of emotion, memory, and fear. Whether the seamstress was intentionally malevolent, inadvertently influential, or herself ensnared by forces beyond understanding, the surviving bride's narratives ensure that her legend endures, whispered through archives, journals, and oral histories alike. The gowns, the shadows, and the whispers persist as symbols of uncertainty. They serve as a reminder that even survival can carry horror, that observation is never neutral, and that grief and skill, when intertwined, may leave traces long after the hand that shaped them has departed. In this section, the tension between perception and reality, trauma and superstition, and innocence and malevolence reaches its apex, offering no answers, only haunting questions that echo in the folds of silk. The disappearance of Elise Moreau, the seamstress whose gowns had already carved fear and fascination into the hearts of Marseille, left a void that no record could fill. Once she vanished, the threads of fact, rumor, and imagination multiplied, tangling together in ways that transformed tragedy into legend. Her absence did not quiet the whispers. It amplified them. Local newspapers, court documents, and diaries from the era became fertile ground for speculation. The populace, hungry for narrative and explanation, quickly populated her story with theories both plausible and fantastical. Some asserted that she had been executed in secret, hidden from public trial, to preserve the reputation of her patrons. Officials, wary of scandal, might have carried her body beneath the chapel floor, a symbolic burial under stone that mirrored the burial of truth itself. Records of renovations and floor repairs around the time of her disappearance only fueled such claims, each plank and slab taken as evidence of a hidden grave. Yet no remains ever surfaced. And where the material evidence failed, folklore rushed in to bridge the gap. Villagers whispered of gowns that traveled with her across the countryside, carrying whispers, shadows, and even misfortune to those who dared wear them. One tale tells of a dress left behind in the home of a distant noblewoman. The bride who tried it on awoke screaming, claiming the silk had whispered threats of death. Farmers spoke of her presence in nearby villages, linking sudden livestock deaths and crop failures to the invisible touch of the seamstress. Oral tradition amplified and replicated these stories, giving rise to motifs of haunted garments and cursed craftsmanship that would persist for generations. These narratives often depicted her as a figure simultaneously monstrous and pitiable. Some versions cast her as a calculated villain, intentionally weaving sorrow into silk, targeting brides for reasons known only to her. Others suggested she had been a woman overwhelmed by grief and misfortune, whose emotions seeped into every stitch, transforming sorrow into something that could influence the world around her. Psychologists later recognized echoes of trauma in her behavior, the loss of affiances, years of isolation, the grinding monotony of candlelit labor. Could grief and unresolved anger manifest outwardly in a manner so tangible that others felt its effects? The surviving account suggests that, whether or not it was conscious, her emotional intensity became a palpable force, experienced through the very fabric she touched. Theologians, too, weighed in on her legend. Some claimed her actions, intentional or not, were a parable of pride and vengeance. The gowns she crafted symbolized both temptation and judgment. In sermons, she was described as a test of moral vigilance, a cautionary example that beauty could conceal malevolence and innocence might harbor ruin. Biblical metaphors, poisoned chalices, cursed bread, and deceptive garments were invoked to frame her tale within divine morality. To the clergy, the question was not simply whether she had harmed others, but whether human pride or weakness could channel forces beyond comprehension. Scholars of folklore note that the multiplicity of her story illustrates how myths evolve in a community. Every retelling added a new layer. The seamstress became at once a spectral traveler, a purveyor of grief, a mysterious artisan whose skills could influence fate. Carnival performances dramatized her exploits. Plays depicted brides collapsing mid-ceremony, dresses moving with their own volition, and shadows twisting across grand halls. In these cultural artifacts, her legend was codified, ensuring that even those unaware of her life in Marseille would inherit her mythic presence. Psychological interpretations further complicate the picture. Survivors' visions, once attributed to physical or supernatural causes, are now examined as possible manifestations of hysteria, trauma, and social influence. The fears surrounding her gowns may have amplified perception, transforming ordinary sensations, creaking silk, shifting folds, uneven seams into experiences interpreted as supernatural. Yet these interpretations coexist uneasily with reports of chemical irritation or unexplained marks on the skin, raising the question: could a combination of psychological and physical factors converge to produce genuine terror? Scholars remain divided, unable to fully separate phenomenon from perception. Even the notion of her escape adds layers of intrigue. Some claim she fled to distant villages, disappearing into anonymity while leaving behind garments imbued with her lingering sorrow. These gowns reportedly caused misfortune for new brides, linking her presence to a string of inexplicable accidents and deaths. In other versions, she traveled disguised as a traveling seamstress or a peddler, blending into ordinary life while quietly shaping fates through clothing. The multiplicity of possibilities, execution, flight, mystical curse, ensured that certainty would remain elusive. Modern criminologists examine her life through the lens of early psychological profiling. Her meticulous attention to detail, periods of isolation, and the recurring pattern of harm associated with her craft raise questions about intent and agency. Could she have harbored antisocial tendencies, directing subtle forms of control or retribution through her skills? Or was she merely a conduit for trauma, grief, and societal projection? Each interpretation carries weight, yet none fully resolves the narrative, leaving the seamstress suspended between history and myth. The persistence of her story underscores a human need to find meaning in horror. Where evidence fails, imagination thrives. The seamstress of Marseille became a repository for communal fears, of grief unprocessed, of beauty masking malevolence, of ordinary objects transformed into instruments of dread. Her gowns, stitched with meticulous care, serve as enduring symbols of uncertainty and fascination. Folklorists, historians, psychologists, and theologians alike return to her tale, drawn to the tension between what is known and what is imagined. Ultimately, the legend of Elise Moreau is not confined to a single outcome. Whether monster, martyr, cursed, or cunning, she remains undefined. The more closely one examines the stitches, the more the pattern shifts. Each theory, each retelling, each whispered account adds a thread to the tapestry, yet leaves gaps that no scholarship can fully bridge. Her story, woven with grief, skill, and speculation, persists as a labyrinth of uncertainty, an emblem of how myth grows from life, and how the search for truth can sometimes only deepen the mystery. Today, the manor where Elise Moreau once labored tirelessly stands empty, its windows like hollow eyes watching over Marseille's quiet streets. Yet the villagers' whispers refuse to die. They speak of a chest hidden in a forgotten corner, where the infamous wedding gown rests. Its lace has yellowed with age, delicate threads brittle beneath time's weight, but some claim that the curse endures, as palpable now as it was over a century ago. Passersby report strange occurrences, faint weeping echoing through the halls, shadows gliding across abandoned rooms, and on rare nights, the faint glint of a needle moving as if guided by unseen fingers. Was the seamstress ever truly punished for the horrors her hands wrought? Or does she continue her work in silence, weaving malice into eternity, her sorrow transmuted into fabric that still touches the living? Skeptics dismiss such tales as folklore spun from grief and tragedy, a community's attempt to explain what rationality could not. Yet for every rationalist, another account surfaces. Brides who felt sudden chills while holding garments linked to her. Merchants who swore their silks and ribbons carried an unnatural weight. Historians who trace misfortunes back to the same district. The lines between coincidence, fear, and supernatural interference blur, leaving no consensus, no solace. Perhaps the truth was buried with her, hidden beneath stone in memory. Perhaps it lingers, stitched invisibly into every retelling of her story, embroidered into the shadows of the manor and the minds of those who dare speak of it. Even literature and theater have kept her alive. Novels describe brides fainting as the seamstress spirit hovers near, needle poised to continue her meticulous, vengeful work. Romantic poets liken the dress to a spectral shroud, innocent in appearance, but carrying the weight of grief and wrath. Folklorists argue that these retellings do more than entertain. They preserve the psychological truth of collective fear, the fascination with innocence corrupted, and the fragile line between grief and malevolence. Every story recirculates her presence, ensuring that the legend grows, spreading across generations like a shadow that never fully dissipates. The unanswered questions haunt every corner of the narrative. Did she escape justice, fleeing to continue her work elsewhere? Was she a victim, transformed by suffering into a figure of dread? Or was she something in between human and supernatural? Grief and vengeance entwined so completely that separating them is impossible? Even modern scholars, armed with historical records, psychological theory, and forensic insight, cannot resolve her legacy. The wedding gown, the needle, and the faint scent of lavender that supposedly lingers in the chest's vicinity resist explanation. Ultimately, the dress waits in the shadows, not merely as fabric and lace, but as a symbol of uncertainty. The story of Elise Moreau remains unresolved, compelling us to ask, when beauty becomes inseparable from danger, can we ever truly trust what we wear or the hands that made it? Every whispered rumor, every archival fragment, every vivid retelling is a stitch in the ongoing tapestry of her legend. The dress endures, a haunting presence, and the seamstress herself, perhaps in body, perhaps in spirit, remains behind the veil, reminding us that some horrors are stitched into time, and some mysteries are never meant to be solved.